The rain was the first sign. In America, rain is just weather. It's an inconvenience, something you check on your phone app before deciding if you need a jacket. Here, in the jagged heart of Guizhou province, the rain was different. It was an entity, a presence. For 3 days, it hadn't been falling so much as the sky itself had been collapsing, coming down in thick gray sheets that erased the world beyond your window. It was a sound like a billion tiny drums, a constant nerve-shredding static that promised to wash everything away. My name is Jake Callahan. I'm a photographer. Or I was. Lately, I felt more like a professional ghost, haunting the edges of other people's lives, capturing images that felt increasingly hollow. I came to Guizhou for the bridges. That's what my editor in New York wanted. Big, glossy spreads for a Sunday magazine feature on China's New Silk Road. "Show them the miracle, Jake," he'd said over a crackling line. "Show them the scale, the ambition, the stuff we can't build anymore." And I had. I'd spent a week dangling from safety harnesses, clinging to catwalks under colossal structures like the Huangjiang Grand Canyon Bridge, a 625-meter-high monster of steel and concrete stitching 2 mountains together over a chasm that looked like a crack in the planet. The photos were magnificent, cold, perfect. They showed power and engineering genius. They showed a nation bending nature to its will. I was wrong. Nature doesn't bend. It waits. And then it breaks you. I was in Rongjiang, a district capital of about 300,000 souls, when the waiting ended. It was supposed to be my last stop before heading back to the sterile comfort of a Shanghai hotel. It was a small city, nestled in a valley, a river of the same name curling around it like a protective arm. Now that arm was becoming a fist. The night of June 23rd, the drumming of the rain changed. It deepened. It grew a throat. A low, guttural roar began to build, a sound that you felt in your bones before you heard it with your ears. I stood at the window of my third-floor hotel room, watching the streetlights bleed into the churning, brown water that was no longer contained by the riverbanks. It was a living thing, a hungry thing. My phone buzzed, a red alert from the provincial weather service, a typhoon of text in Mandarin that my translation app struggled with. I got the gist. Record rainfall, river surge, evacuate. Evacuate to where? The street was already a river. I saw a car, its lights still on, get lifted by the current and swept sideways, crashing into a storefront with a sickening crunch. The lights went out. The city plunged into a deeper darkness, punctuated only by the strobing flashes of distant lightning that revealed a world turning to liquid chaos. Then came the new sound, a high-pitched collective shriek. It wasn't a siren, it was people. Thousands of them, and mixed with it the amplified, distorted blare of a loudspeaker, a man's voice frantic and repeating, swallowed by the roar of the water. This wasn't just a flood, this was the apocalypse arriving by water. I grabbed my camera bag. Instinct. It's what I do. I document. I witness. I sealed my main camera and lenses in waterproof bags, my hands shaking, my passport, my wallet. I shoved a few protein bars in my pockets, then I looked at the door of my hotel room. And I hesitated. The smart move was to go up, get to the roof, wait for rescue. But I wasn't smart. I was a journalist. And the story was down there, in the water, in the dark. I opened the door. The hallway was already ankle-deep in murky water. A few other guests, mostly Chinese families, were splashing their way towards the emergency stairs, their faces pale masks of terror. A mother clutched her small child, who was crying silently, too scared to even make a sound. An old man was being helped by his son, his eyes wide with a confusion that was more heartbreaking than fear. I went down. The hotel lobby was a nightmare. The elegant furniture was bobbing and spinning in the churning brown tide that was now waist-deep. The water had shattered the plate glass windows, and the full force of the street river was pouring in. It was a waterfall where the entrance used to be. The roar was deafening. It smelled of mud and sewage and something else. The smell of absolute ruin. I saw the night manager, a young man named Leo, who had proudly practiced his English with me just that afternoon, clinging to the reception desk. His face was slick with sweat and river water. "Go back," he screamed at me over the din. "Go to the roof. It's not safe." "What's happening?" I yelled back, my voice sounding thin and useless. "The dikes, they're gone. The whole river, it's coming." Before I could process that, a new sound cut through the chaos, the rending, groaning scream of tortured metal. The entire ground floor of the building shuddered. We looked towards the source of the noise. The city's largest shopping mall was connected to our hotel, and the water had found its way in. It wasn't a leak. The main entrance of the mall gave way entirely. A solid wall of dark water filled with debris exploded into the vast, glittering atrium. It was a scene from a disaster movie, but the special effects were real. The smell was real. The cold, filthy water surging around my legs was real. The water hit the main escalators, and it turned them into a waterfall, a muddy, violent cascade of water that thundered down from the second floor, tearing away panels, signs, and anything else in its path. I raised my camera, my hands working on their own, and started shooting. The click of the shutter was a tiny, insane sound in the middle of this symphony of destruction. Merchandise was being swept away, brightly colored clothes from a fashion boutique, mannequins, their plastic limbs contorted in grotesque poses, bobbing like corpses. Electronics from a flagship store, their screens dark, their circuits fried. I saw the owner of a small jewelry shop, a woman I'd seen earlier that day, standing on a chair, her face a mask of disbelief as her entire life's work, thousands of tiny glittering pieces in glass cases, was swallowed by the brown sludge. She wasn't crying. She was just watching, catatonic. I felt a tug on my arm. It was Leo. He was pointing towards a service staircase at the back of the lobby. "This way, it goes to the upper floors. We have to go now." We waded through the surge, the current pulling at us, trying to drag us into the mall's new deadly vortex. The water was filled with things, sharp things, heavy things. Something hard and metallic slammed into my thigh, and I cried out in pain. I looked down and saw a cash register tumbling past me in the current. We reached the stairs just as a section of the first-floor ceiling in the mall collapsed with a deafening crash, sending a new wave surging towards us. We scrambled up the concrete steps, the water chasing us, licking at our heels. We made it to the second floor and slammed the heavy fire door shut. We stood there in the dark, narrow stairwell, dripping and panting, our breath fogging up the air. The roar from below was muffled now, but it was still there, the sound of a monster chewing on the bones of the city. For a long time, we just stood there, listening to our own ragged breathing. The adrenaline started to fade, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. We were alive, but we were trapped. Trapped in a concrete box in a city that was drowning. We spent the night on the third floor, huddled with about 50 other survivors in a large conference room. The power was out, the only light coming from our cell phones, which we used sparingly to conserve the batteries. The cell network was a ghost, flickering in and out of existence. Every so often a message would get through, a frantic text from a loved one, and a small sob would break the silence. I sat by the window, my camera in my lap. The lightning had moved on, and now there was only the oppressive uniform darkness, but the sounds remained, the constant hungry gurgle of the water, the distant sharp crack of a building or a bridge giving way, and worst of all, the faint, desperate cries for help that were sometimes carried on the wind, only to be swallowed by the roar. Leo found a case of bottled water and some stale crackers from a storage closet. It was a feast. We sat together sharing the meager rations. "My parents," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "They live on the other side of the river, in the old quarter. The houses there are low, they are old." He didn't need to finish the sentence. I just nodded, a useless gesture in the dark. "What about you?" he asked. "You have family back in America?" "Yeah," I said, "ex-wife, a kid I see twice a year. They probably think I'm shooting some pretty pictures of a bridge." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. It sounded ugly. "This is a historic flood," Leo said, repeating a phrase he must have heard on the news before the power went out. "Not seen in 30 years. "This isn't history, Leo," I said, looking out at the black water that had devoured a city. "This is a warning." Dawn came not with light, but with a slow gray dilution of the darkness, and it revealed the true extent of the horror. Rongjiang was gone. It was an archipelago of rooftops in a vast brown sea. The water was a thick, viscous soup, choked with the debris of a million lives. Cars, trees, furniture, shipping containers. I saw the bloated carcasses of pigs and other livestock spinning slowly in the eddies. The air was thick with the stench of rot and diesel and something anciently foul. Then we saw them. The first signs of hope. Small inflatable boats manned by firefighters in bright orange uniforms navigating the treacherous new waterways. They moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, shouting through megaphones, their voices a counterpoint to the water's relentless gurgle. We hammered on the windows, screaming until our throats were raw. It took them 2 hours to reach us. A young captain, his face etched with exhaustion but his eyes sharp and focused, directed the evacuation. They rigged a rope system from our window to a nearby building that was on higher ground. We went across one by one, suspended in a harness over the churning water. It was terrifying, but as I was clipped in, the young captain gave my shoulder a firm squeeze. "We have you," he said in clipped English, and for the first time in a long time, I believed someone. From the relative safety of the other building, I watched them work. They were pulling people from rooftops, from windows, from trees. I saw a firefighter rappel down a wall to reach an elderly woman trapped on her balcony. I saw volunteers in their own small fishing boats wading through the filth to pass supplies to stranded families. It was a picture of chaos, but it was also a picture of breathtaking compassion. I raised my camera again. This was the other side of the story. This was the miracle. Not the bridges of steel, but these small, fragile bridges of human decency. They took us to a temporary shelter set up in a school on a hill overlooking the drowned city. It was a scene of organized chaos. Doctors and nurses were treating the injured. Volunteers were handing out blankets and bowls of hot instant noodles. Families were being reunited in tearful, desperate embraces, and many, many more were just sitting, staring into space, their faces blank with the shock of losing everything. My press pass got me closer to the command center. I learned the statistics. Over 48,900 people evacuated from Rongjiang alone. The river had crested at a record 114.6 meters. At one point, they said, projections showed it could hit 255 meters, a number so ludicrous it defied imagination. The economic damage was already in the billions of yuan. The human cost was still being counted, at least 6 dead confirmed, many more missing. I spent the next 2 days documenting the aftermath. I hitched a ride on a military transport truck, heading to survey the damage. The scale of it was biblical. The landscape was scarred, broken. We passed through villages that had been scoured from the earth, leaving only foundations slick with mud. We saw fields of crops buried under a thick layer of silt. The most surreal sight was the Huji Bridge. It was part of the massive Xiamen-Chengdu Expressway, one of those monuments to engineering I had been sent to photograph. Now, a huge section of it was simply gone. It had collapsed into the 100-meter deep chasm below, and there, dangling precariously over the edge, held only by the twisted guardrail and the grace of God, was a container truck. We stopped. The driver, a man in his 40s, had already been rescued. He was sitting by the side of the road, wrapped in a blanket, shaking uncontrollably. But the truck remained, a monument to a different kind of miracle. The miracle of sheer dumb luck. I stood at the edge of the abyss, my camera feeling like a toy. This was the image that would define the story, the symbol of it all. China's unstoppable march of progress, its mastery over the earth, brought to a standstill by mud and water. A multi-ton truck hanging by a thread, a perfect metaphor for a nation's hubris hanging over the precipice of a climate it had helped to unbalance. That evening, back at the shelter, I met May. She was a university student, maybe 20 or 21. She was volunteering, her small frame lost in an oversized relief worker vest. She was translating for a foreign medical team, her English fluent and precise, but there was a shadow in her eyes, a deep-seated weariness that didn't belong on a face so young. I was trying to interview a local official, a gruff, chain-smoking man who was barking orders and had no time for a foreign reporter. May stepped in. "He says they are doing everything they can," she translated, her voice soft but steady. "He says the party and the government are mobilized. The People's Liberation Army is here. He says to tell you that China is strong." "Ask him if China is strong enough to stop the next one," I said, a bit more harshly than I intended. May looked at me, and for a second, the professional veneer cracked. I saw the fear underneath. She didn't translate my question. Instead, she said to the official in Mandarin, "The foreign journalist expresses his admiration for the rescue efforts and the resilience of the Chinese people." The official grunted, satisfied, and moved on. May turned back to me. "That was not a helpful question," she said quietly. "It was an honest one," I replied. She sighed, a sound of profound exhaustion. "Honesty is a luxury right now, Mr. Callahan. We need hope." "Jake," I said, "and I think people need the truth more." We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the shelter swirling around us. "My family," she said suddenly, her voice dropping so low I had to lean in to hear. "They live in a small village upriver from here. Sanjiang. I haven't been able to reach them for 3 days." My cynical reporter's brain, a part of me I despised, immediately saw the story, the human angle, the personal quest. But the other part of me, the part that had seen the body bags and the faces of the grieving, just felt a pang of empathy. "The roads are out," I said, stating the obvious. "I know," she said, her gaze fixed on the dark hills in the distance. "But I saw you with the camera. You go to places, you get on the trucks. I thought, maybe—" Her voice trailed off. It was a desperate, impossible request. A civilian asking a foreigner to help her get into the heart of a disaster zone during a military-run relief operation. It was insane. "I can't promise anything, May," I said slowly, "but I'm heading that way tomorrow. I'm trying to get to Sandu County, near where your village is. I want to see the upstream damage. If you can get the right permissions, maybe you can ride along." It was a half-lie. I had no firm plans, but looking at her face, at the desperate hope flickering in her eyes, I knew I had to try for her, and maybe for me too. Maybe this was the real story, not the collapsed bridges or the drowned malls, but this, a daughter's search for her family in the ruins of her world. Getting the permissions was a bureaucratic nightmare that somehow, miraculously worked. My press credentials, combined with May's quiet persistence and the fact that she was a registered volunteer translator, got us a spot on a flatbed truck carrying engineering equipment. The journey was a descent into a special kind of hell. The main roads were gone, buried under landslides or simply washed away. Our driver, a grizzled PLA sergeant with a face like a topographical map of Guizhou itself, navigated a treacherous maze of mud tracks and temporary roads carved into the mountainside. The landscape was unrecognizable. The lush green mountains I had admired just a week ago were now stripped bare, bleeding red earth. The air was heavy with the smell of pine needles and wet soil, a strangely clean scent that couldn't mask the underlying stench of decay that wafted up from the valleys below. May was quiet for most of the ride, her hands clenched tightly in her lap, her eyes scanning every ruin we passed as if searching for something familiar. I tried to make small talk, to distract her, but the words felt cheap and pointless. What do you say to someone whose entire world is hanging by a thread? "My father is a farmer," she said at one point, her voice flat. "He grows tea, he knows the river. He always said, 'Never turn your back on the water, May, it has a long memory.'" She looked at the brown torrent raging in the valley below us. I think he was right. We passed a work crew trying to clear a landslide. Dozens of men, covered in mud from head to toe, working with shovels and heavy machinery under the relentless weeping sky. They looked like figures from a Bruegel painting, a scene of epic, futile labor against an unforgiving backdrop. "They say this is climate change," I said, mostly to myself. "The World Meteorological Organization says Asia is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world." May looked at me. "We don't need a report to tell us that. My grandfather says the seasons are broken. The summers are hotter than fire. The rains, they are not the rains he remembers from when he was a boy. They are angry. Angry rains." That felt right. This wasn't just precipitation. It felt personal. It felt malevolent. As we got closer to Sandu County, the destruction intensified. We were climbing higher into the mountains, into the cracks in the earth that defined Guizhou's terrain. Here, the water hadn't just risen, it had fallen. It had come down the mountainsides in torrents, creating new canyons, tearing away roads, and obliterating anything in its path. Our truck could go no further. A bridge, smaller than the Huji but just as vital, was gone. A twisted mess of steel lay in the gorge below. From here, we would have to go on foot. "My village is another 5 kilometers from here," May said, pointing across the valley. "On the other side of that ridge." The sergeant gave us 2 bottles of water and a solemn nod. "Be careful," he said. "The ground is not stable, and there are things in the water." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. The hike was brutal. The air was thick and humid, making it hard to breathe. The ground was a treacherous soup of mud and loose rock. Every step was a risk. We used walking sticks we fashioned from fallen branches to probe the ground ahead of us. The silence here was different from the silence in the city. It wasn't an absence of noise. It was filled with the sounds of a wounded earth, the trickle of 1,000 tiny streams, the sucking sound of the mud, the distant mournful cry of a bird, and underneath it all the constant low growl of the main river in the valley, a beast resting after its feast. We found a narrow, precarious path that hugged the side of the mountain. It was barely wide enough for one person. To our left was a sheer rock face weeping water. To our right, a dizzying drop to the valley floor. I am not afraid of heights. I had spent days hanging from bridges, but this was different. This was nature, raw and untamed. There were no safety harnesses here. Halfway along the path, we had to cross a place where a landslide had torn a 20-foot gap. A few fallen trees formed a makeshift bridge. It was slick with mud and algae. "I can't," May whispered, her face pale. "Yes, you can," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Look at me, one step at a time, don't look down." I went first, my heart pounding in my chest. The log groaned under my weight. I could feel it shift slightly. I kept my eyes fixed on the other side. I made it across, my legs trembling. "Okay, your turn," I called back, my voice hoarse. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. She started across, her movements slow and deliberate. She was halfway there when her foot slipped. She cried out, her arms flailing as she fought for balance. I lunged forward, grabbing her hand just as she was about to fall. I pulled, my muscles screaming in protest. For a terrifying second, I thought we were both going to go over. Her weight, combined with the unstable ground under my feet, was pulling me towards the edge. Then, with a final desperate heave, I yanked her onto the solid ground beside me. We collapsed in a heap, gasping for air, our hearts hammering in unison. She was shaking, her hands still locked in mine. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Don't thank me," I panted. "Let's just get the hell out of here." We pushed on, the near disaster giving us a new, grim determination. As we crested the final ridge, May stopped. She let out a small, strangled gasp. I came up beside her and looked down. There was no village. Where Sanjiang should have been, there was just a vast, placid lake of brown water. The only sign that a community had ever existed there were a few rooftops poking through the surface like tombstones in a liquid graveyard. A massive landslide from the mountain opposite had come down and acted as a dam, trapping the floodwaters and turning the entire valley into a basin. May just stared, her face completely devoid of expression. The hope that had carried her this far, that had driven her across that treacherous log, simply evaporated, leaving a void behind. "No," she whispered. The word was not a protest. It was a statement of fact, a recognition of an impossible reality. She started to run, stumbling down the muddy slope towards the water's edge. I ran after her, shouting her name. She reached the edge of the new, terrible lake and just stopped, her small figure silhouetted against the vast expanse of brown. And then she began to scream. It was not a human sound. It was a raw, primal cry of absolute agony, a sound of a soul being torn in two. It echoed across the silent water, a sound of grief so immense that the mountains themselves seemed to shrink from it. I stood behind her, my camera hanging uselessly at my side. There was no picture to take here. There was no story to tell. There was only this unbearable, silent devastation and the sound of a young woman's heart breaking. The water was perfectly still. It had done its work. Now it was just resting, holding its secrets deep within its murky depths. May's screams eventually subsided into ragged, gut-wrenching sobs. She sank to her knees in the mud, her body shaking. I walked over and knelt beside her, putting my arm around her shoulders. She didn't resist. She just leaned into me, her tears soaking my shirt, and cried until there were no tears left. We stayed there for hours, as the gray afternoon bled into a purple twilight. We didn't speak. There were no words. What could I say? "I'm sorry for your loss." It sounded like a blasphemy. "I'm sorry that the rain got angry. I'm sorry that the mountains are tired of holding us up. I'm sorry that our desire for progress, for bigger bridges and faster trains, has broken the seasons. As darkness fell, a new horror emerged. A smell. The smell the PLA sergeant had warned me about. The sweet, cloying stench of mass death rising from the water. The water was no longer just a lake. It was a grave for a village. A grave for May's parents, her friends, her past, her future. I finally managed to get her to her feet. "We can't stay here, May," I said gently. "It's not safe." She looked at me, her eyes hollow. "Nowhere is safe," she said. The words were a flat, dead thing. The journey back was a blur, a slow, agonizing trudge through the darkness guided only by the weak beam of my flashlight. May moved like an automaton, her body present, but her spirit left behind at the edge of that terrible lake. Every step was a monumental effort. We didn't speak. The silence between us was heavier than the humid air, thicker than the mud that clung to our boots. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of Sanjiang village. We finally stumbled back to the washed-out bridge where the truck had left us. By some miracle, a different military vehicle was there, its headlights cutting through the gloom. They were evacuating a small group of survivors from another isolated hamlet. They had seen our light. They helped us into the back of the truck. No one asked any questions. Our mud-caked clothes and May's vacant, haunted expression told the whole story. An old woman gave May a piece of dried fruit. May took it, her hand trembling, but she didn't eat. She just held it, staring at it as if it were an artifact from another planet. Back at the sprawling, chaotic shelter in Rongjiang, the world felt unreal. The noise, the lights, the sheer number of living, breathing people felt like an assault after the profound silence of the dead valley. A doctor checked May over, gave her a mild sedative, and led her to a cot in the makeshift infirmary. I watched her go, a small lost figure disappearing into the crowd. I found a corner to myself, slumped against a wall, and finally let the full weight of it all crash down on me. I didn't have a camera in my hand, but the images were burned onto the inside of my eyelids. The waterfall in the shopping mall, the truck dangling from the broken bridge, the small, hopeful faces of the rescuers, and the placid brown water covering a village, a final, terrible image of nature's quiet, absolute victory. My editor had wanted pictures of China's strength, its magnificent infrastructure, its power to tame the wild, and I had them. But they were lies. The real strength wasn't in the steel and concrete. It was in the firefighter who risked his life for an old woman. It was in the volunteer who shared her last bottle of water. It was in the quiet resilience of a people who had lost everything but their humanity. And the real power wasn't in the bridges that spanned the chasms. It was in the water that had so effortlessly erased them. I pulled out my satellite phone, the charge almost gone. I had to file something. My editor would be demanding his story on China's infrastructure crisis. I started to type a message. Subject, Guizhou. The story is not the bridges. The story is the rain. I thought about May, about her father's words. Never turn your back on the water. It has a long memory. We had built a world on the assumption that we could control it, that we could pave over it, dam it up, and force it to our will. We had turned our backs on it, and now all over the world, from the burning forests of California to the melting ice of the Arctic to the drowned valleys of Guizhou, the water was reminding us of its memory. This flood wasn't a freak event, it was a symptom of a planet in fever, a planet pushed to its breaking point by our own ambition. We were like the truck driver on the Huji Bridge, racing along an expressway of progress, blind to the fact that the very foundation beneath us was about to crumble. The next morning, I found May sitting on her cot, awake. She looked smaller, more fragile than before. She was holding the piece of dried fruit the old woman had given her. "I need to find my uncle," she said, her voice raspy. "He lives in Guiyang. He's all I have left." I nodded. "I can help you get there." I used my press credentials and a significant amount of cash to arrange for a private car. The main highways were still a mess, but some secondary roads were passable. The drive to the provincial capital was a slow, surreal journey through a wounded land. We saw work crews everywhere, a frantic, desperate effort to stitch the province back together, but it felt like putting a band-aid on a mortal wound. You can rebuild a bridge, but how do you rebuild a season? How do you fix a broken climate? The government was already spinning the narrative. The talk was of resilience, of heroism, of rebuilding bigger and better. The disaster was being framed as a test, one that the Chinese people, under the wise leadership of the party, had passed with flying colors. The bright spots of the rescue were being amplified, the dark truths of inadequate drainage systems and the folly of building in vulnerable floodplains quietly swept under the rug. It was the same script I'd heard after every disaster in every country, the politics of survival, but for the people who had lived it, for the thousands of families who had lost their homes, their livelihoods, their loved ones, the truth was much simpler and much more brutal. It was the truth I saw in May's empty eyes. It was the truth of a world where humanity's relentless confrontation with nature was doomed to fail. We had to learn to coexist. We found May's uncle in a small apartment on the outskirts of Guiyang. He was a kind, gentle man who wept openly when he saw her. He held her, and for the first time since she had seen her drowned village, May's body was racked with sobs. She was safe for now. She had a place to grieve. My work was done. I had my pictures. I had my story. A story far more profound and terrible than the one I had been sent to find. I booked a flight to New York. Before I left, I went to see May one last time. I gave her an envelope with all the cash I had left. It wasn't much, but it was something. "You don't have to do that," she said, her voice still weak. "Yes, I do," I said. "Start over, May. Live. For them." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes again. "What will you do now, Jake?" I looked at the camera bag at my feet. "I'm going to tell your story," I said. "I'm going to tell the world about the angry rain." On the plain, high above the clouds, I looked out the window. The earth below was hidden, a patchwork of white and gray. It looked peaceful, deceptive. I opened my laptop and began to write. I ignored the emails from my editor. I ignored the market-friendly angles and the geopolitical analysis. I wrote about the roar of the water and the smell of the mud. I wrote about the impossible courage of the rescuers and the bottomless grief of a daughter. I wrote about a small village called Sanjiang, a place that no longer existed on any map, but which was now the center of my world. The story of Guizhou wasn't just a Chinese story. It was a human story, a warning scrolled across a wounded landscape in the universal language of water and mud, a message from the heart of a broken planet. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that it was a story we were all going to be living in one way or another for the rest of our lives. The rain was coming for all of us.